Broken Cowboy Arrow. Daisy Tate had resigned herself to a loveless marriage, but just before she could say her vows, Rhett Callahan burst into the church, his revolver gleaming in the candlelight. He grabbed her wrist, his grip unrelenting. "You were never meant for him, Daisy," he murmured. "And now you never will be." Chapter 1. The Unwanted Wedding Bells. The scent of wilting lilies hung heavy in the air, mingling unpleasantly with the nervous perspiration of the assembled guests. Daisy Tate stood stiffly at the altar of the dusty little church in Harmony Creek, her gaze fixed on the chipped paint of the wooden cross behind Reverend Miller. Her heart felt like a trapped bird, fluttering frantically against the bars of a cage she'd helped construct. Today, she was to marry Samuel Thompson, a man as sturdy and predictable as the oak trees that lined his prosperous ranch. A man she did not love. She smoothed down the ivory satin of her borrowed gown, a hand-me-down from Samuel's sister, Clara. It felt foreign against her skin, a symbol of a life she wasn't sure she wanted. The dress, though beautiful, felt like a shroud, burying the vibrant, independent woman she once believed herself to be. Samuel was a good man, a practical choice, a provider. Her aging father, weathered by years of relentless sun and dwindling fortune, had made that abundantly clear. Marriage to Samuel was the only way to secure their failing ranch, the only way to keep a roof over their heads. Love, her father had scoffed, was a luxury they could no longer afford. Daisy's fingers traced the delicate lace at her wrist, a stark contrast to the calluses she'd earned working alongside her father since she was a girl. She remembered a time, years ago, when she dreamt of a different kind of wedding. A smaller affair, perhaps, under a vast, starlit sky, with wildflowers woven into her hair and a love that burned brighter than any church candle. But those dreams had withered like the wildflowers in the harsh desert sun, replaced by the grim reality of her family's plight. Reverend Miller cleared his throat, his voice echoing in the hushed stillness. "Dearly beloved," he began, his words sounding hollow even to Daisy's own ears. She stole a glance at Samuel, standing beside her, his broad shoulders rigid with a nervous energy she couldn't quite interpret. He was a handsome man, in a rugged sort of way, with kind eyes and a strong jaw. But there was no spark, no flicker of passion that could ignite the dormant embers of her soul. Her gaze drifted to the back of the church, to the heavy oak doors that seemed to represent an escape she could never truly grasp. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. The air was thick with anticipation, the silence almost unbearable. She wished, with a sudden, desperate longing, that something, anything, would happen to disrupt this charade. And then it did. The doors burst open with a violence that shattered the strained tranquility. A figure stood silhouetted against the blinding light, a man tall and imposing, his features obscured by the shadows. But Daisy recognized the glint of steel in his hand, the cold, hard gleam of a revolver. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Fear, raw and visceral, pulsed through Daisy's veins, momentarily eclipsing the dull ache of resignation. The man strode forward, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, each step a thunderclap in the stunned silence. He moved with a predatory grace, a dangerous confidence that sent shivers down Daisy's spine. As he drew closer, the shadows receded, revealing a face that was both strikingly handsome and undeniably ruthless. Sharp, hawk-like eyes, the color of a stormy sky, scanned the room, settling finally on Daisy. Rhett Callahan. The name echoed in her mind, a whisper of legend and fear. He was an outlaw, a bandit, a man whispered about in hushed tones around campfires. A ghost from a past she had tried, and failed, to bury. She hadn't seen him in 5 years, not since the day he rode out of her life, leaving behind a void that had never truly healed. And now, he was here, in this sacred space, disrupting the carefully constructed facade of her new life. He stopped before the altar, his gaze locking with hers. There was no tenderness in his eyes, only a fierce, possessive intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. He reached for her, his hand, calloused and strong, closing around her wrist. The touch, though rough, sent an unexpected jolt of electricity through her, a sensation she hadn't felt in years. "You were never meant for him, Daisy," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that resonated deep within her. The words were a challenge, a declaration, a promise of something both terrifying and exhilarating. "And now," he continued, his grip tightening on her wrist, a possessive claim that sent a tremor of both fear and a strange, forbidden thrill through her, "you never will be." The church erupted in chaos. Women screamed, men shouted, and Samuel, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and disbelief, lunged forward. But Rhett was faster. He pulled Daisy towards him, shielding her with his body as he raised his revolver, firing a shot into the ceiling. The gunshot echoed like a thunderclap, silencing the room instantly. Plaster rained down, a fine white dust settling on the terrified faces of the wedding guests. Daisy felt a strange detachment, as if she were watching the scene unfold from a distance. The fear was still there, but it was mingled with a sense of inevitability, as if this moment had been destined to happen all along. Rhett's presence, his touch, his words, had awakened something within her, a dormant spirit that refused to be silenced. She had resigned herself to a life of quiet desperation, but now, standing beside this dangerous, captivating man, she felt a flicker of something she thought she'd lost forever: hope. He didn't give anyone a chance to react. With a swift, decisive movement, he pulled her out of the church into the blinding sunlight. The heat of the desert air enveloped her, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the church. She stumbled, her legs unsteady, but Rhett's grip remained firm, guiding her towards a waiting horse, a magnificent black stallion that pawed the ground impatiently. As he hoisted her onto the horse, their eyes met again. This time, she saw something flicker in his gaze, a hint of vulnerability beneath the hardened exterior. It was a fleeting glimpse, quickly masked, but it was enough to make her heart clench with a sudden, unexpected pang of something. Something she couldn't, or perhaps wouldn't name. She was being kidnapped, stolen from her own wedding, by an outlaw. And yet, as she looked into Rhett Callahan's eyes, she felt a strange, unsettling sense of coming home. The wind whipped through her hair as they began their flight, with no indication of how long it would last. Chapter 2. A Bandit's Bold Claim. The black stallion, aptly named Midnight, thundered across the parched landscape, leaving the stunned silence of Harmony Creek far behind. Daisy clung to Rhett, her body pressed against his, the rhythmic pounding of the horse's hooves a frantic counterpoint to the chaotic rhythm of her own heart. The wind whipped her hair across her face, stinging her eyes, but she didn't dare loosen her grip. Fear, raw and primal, coursed through her, yet beneath it, a strange current of exhilaration began to stir. She hadn't spoken a word since he'd dragged her from the church, her mind reeling from the sheer audacity of his actions. He was an outlaw, a man who lived outside the law, a man who had just stolen her from her own wedding. She should be terrified, screaming, fighting. But a part of her, a part she'd long suppressed, felt a strange sense of relief. The carefully constructed life she'd built, the life of quiet compromise and muted dreams, had been shattered in an instant, and she was left with this. A reckless flight across the unforgiving desert with a man she barely knew, a man who represented everything she'd been taught to fear. Rhett rode with a practiced ease, his body moving in perfect harmony with the horse. He was a creature of the wild, as untamed and unpredictable as the landscape around them. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the coiled energy that radiated from him. He was alert, watchful, his senses honed to the slightest shift in the wind, the faintest sound. "Why, Rhett?" she finally managed to ask, her voice hoarse and trembling. The words were barely a whisper, carried away by the wind, but he heard her. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sky met the earth in a shimmering haze of heat. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the pounding of hooves and the rush of the wind. Daisy felt a knot of frustration tighten in her chest. She deserved an explanation, some justification for the chaos he'd unleashed. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough, like the rasp of stones grinding together. "You were marrying the wrong man, Daisy. A man who would have stifled you, who would have buried you alive in that dusty little town." His words struck a chord, resonating with the unspoken fear she'd harbored for months. She had known, deep down, that marrying Samuel was a mistake, a surrender to a life of quiet desperation. But she'd convinced herself it was the only option, the only way to save her family. "My father," she began, her voice trailing off. She couldn't explain the complexities of her situation, the weight of responsibility that had driven her to the altar. Rhett cut her off, his voice hardening. "Your father made his choices, Daisy. You don't have to pay for them." There was a finality in his tone that silenced her. She realized, with a sudden clarity, that he knew more about her situation than she'd thought. He'd been watching, waiting, biding his time. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, they reached a narrow canyon, its walls rising steeply on either side. The air grew cooler, the silence deeper, broken only by the echoing calls of unseen birds. Rhett slowed midnight to a walk, guiding him carefully through the treacherous terrain. They entered a hidden alcove, a small, sheltered space carved into the rock face. A fire pit, ringed with stones, stood in the center, evidence of previous occupants. Rhett dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful, and then reached up to help Daisy down. Her legs were stiff and aching, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. She stumbled slightly as her feet touched the ground, and Rhett caught her, his hands strong and steady on her waist. For a moment, they stood close, their bodies almost touching. Daisy could feel the heat radiating from him, the scent of leather and sweat and something else, something wild and untamed, that made her heart beat faster. He released her abruptly, breaking the spell. "We'll stay here for the night," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "It's safe, for now." He busied himself gathering firewood, his movements efficient and practiced. Daisy watched him, her mind still reeling. She was trapped, in a sense, but the fear she'd felt earlier was slowly giving way to a grudging respect. He was a dangerous man, yes, but he was also capable, resourceful, and strangely protective. As darkness fell, Rhett built a small fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the canyon walls. The warmth was welcome, chasing away the chill of the desert night. He offered her a strip of dried meat and a canteen of water, the simple fare of an outlaw. Daisy ate in silence, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. The firelight illuminated Rhett's face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the intensity of his eyes. He was a man of contradictions, a man of violence and tenderness, a man who had both terrified and intrigued her. "Why me, Rhett?" she asked again, her voice stronger this time. "Why did you choose me?" He met her gaze, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Because you belong with me, Daisy," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. "You always have." His words, spoken with such conviction, such possessiveness, left her breathless. They were a claim, a declaration of ownership that both frightened and fascinated her. She knew she should resist, should fight against this forced intimacy, but a part of her, a part she'd thought long dead, felt a flicker of something she couldn't deny. A spark of attraction, of desire, of something wild and untamed that mirrored the spirit of the man sitting across from her. He was a mystery she was only just beginning to unravel, and she felt a pull, a desperate need for answers in this wild and dangerous new reality. The crackling fire seemed to hold its breath, waiting, along with her. Chapter 3. Across the Whispering Plains. The dawn broke, painting the canyon walls in hues of rose and gold. Daisy awoke to the smell of wood smoke and the sound of Rhett moving quietly around the campsite. She was stiff and sore, her body protesting the unfamiliar hardness of the ground, but her mind felt surprisingly clear. The initial shock of her abduction had worn off, replaced by a cautious curiosity. Rhett offered her a cup of strong, black coffee, brewed over the embers of the fire. It was bitter and potent, but it chased away the lingering fog of sleep. He didn't speak, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, as if he were searching for something she couldn't see. "Where are we going?" she asked, breaking the silence. He turned to her, his eyes, the color of the morning sky, holding a hint of something she couldn't quite decipher. "Away," he said simply. "Away from Harmony Creek, away from Samuel Thompson, away from everything you thought you knew." His words were both a promise and a threat. He was offering her freedom, but it was a freedom tinged with danger, a freedom that came at a price. She didn't know where he was taking her, or what his plans were, but she knew she had no choice but to trust him. For now, at least. They set off as the sun climbed higher in the sky, leaving the sheltered canyon behind. The landscape opened up into a vast, rolling plain, stretching as far as the eye could see. The wind whispered through the tall grasses, carrying the scent of dust and sagebrush. It was a beautiful, desolate place, a place where a person could easily get lost, both physically and emotionally. Rhett rode with a quiet confidence, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He seemed to know this land intimately, every hidden trail, every watering hole, every potential danger. Daisy, on the other hand, felt completely out of her element. She'd spent most of her life on her father's ranch, her world bounded by familiar fences and predictable routines. This vast, untamed wilderness was both exhilarating and terrifying. As they rode, Rhett began to talk, his voice low and measured, as if he were sharing secrets with the wind. He told her stories of the land, of the native tribes who had roamed these plains for centuries, of the pioneers who had braved the harsh conditions to build a new life. He spoke of outlaws and lawmen, of cattle rustlers and gold prospectors, of the constant struggle for survival in this unforgiving territory. His stories were captivating, painting a vivid picture of a world that was both brutal and beautiful. Daisy found herself drawn in, listening with rapt attention. She was learning more about him, too, through the stories he chose to tell, the details he emphasized, the emotions that flickered across his face. He was a man of the land, deeply connected to its rhythms and its secrets. She also learned more about the situation he and she, by extension, had gotten themselves into. Samuel's family was wealthy, powerful, and they would be relentless. They stopped for a brief rest in the shade of a towering rock formation, sharing a meager lunch of dried meat and hardtack. Daisy watched Rhett as he tended to the horses, his movements efficient and graceful. He was a man of action, more comfortable in the saddle than in polite society. "You were there, weren't you?" she asked suddenly, remembering something he'd said the night before. "You were watching me before you took me." He met her gaze, his eyes unreadable. He admitted. "I've been watching you for a long time, Daisy." The admission sent a shiver down her spine. She'd had no idea he was even aware of her existence, let alone that he'd been observing her from afar. It was unsettling, yet also strangely intriguing.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. "Because you weren't meant for that life," he said finally. "You were meant for something more. Something wilder." His words echoed her own unspoken desires, the yearning for a life beyond the confines of duty and obligation. She'd suppressed those desires for so long, convinced herself they were foolish fantasies. But hearing them spoken aloud, by this man, this outlaw, made them feel real, attainable. As they continued their journey, Daisy began to feel a shift within herself. The fear was still there, but it was slowly being replaced by a sense of adventure. She was riding across the open plains with a dangerous, captivating man, escaping a life she hadn't wanted, venturing into the unknown. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also exhilarating. She was alive, truly alive for the first time in years. The wind carried not only the scent of dust and freedom but an awareness, the keen recognition of what she was risking and, with the whisper of the plains, the growing understanding of what she stood to gain. A distant howl wolf or coyote, she couldn't tell, punctuated the thought. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. The days bled into one another, marked by the rising and setting of the sun, the changing landscape, and the growing bond between Daisy and Rhett. They rode through vast plains, across shimmering deserts, and over rugged mountains, each terrain more challenging than the last. Daisy learned to ride like a woman of the West, her initial awkwardness giving way to a newfound confidence. She learned to read the signs of the land, to identify animal tracks, to find water in the most unlikely places. Rhett was a patient teacher, his gruff exterior softening as he shared his knowledge with her. He taught her how to handle a rifle, how to build a fire, how to survive in the wilderness. He was demanding, but also surprisingly gentle, his eyes often lingering on her with a warmth that made her heart flutter. But there were also shadows, glimpses of a past that haunted him. He rarely spoke of his own life, his history shrouded in mystery. But Daisy saw it in the lines etched around his eyes, in the way he sometimes started at sudden noises, in the nightmares that woke him in the dead of night, his body slick with sweat, his voice hoarse with unspoken terrors. One evening, as they sat by a crackling fire under a sky ablaze with stars, Daisy decided to probe the darkness that surrounded him. They had just finished a simple meal of roasted rabbit, the silence between them comfortable, yet charged with unspoken questions. "Tell me about your past, Rhett," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the crackle of the flames. He stiffened, his gaze shifting away from hers, towards the dancing shadows. He hesitated, as if weighing the consequences of revealing his secrets. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the hooting of an owl in the distance. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough, like the rumble of distant thunder. "It's not a pretty story, Daisy," he said. "There's blood and pain and loss. Things you wouldn't understand. Try me," she challenged, her gaze unwavering. She wanted to understand him, to unravel the complexities of this man who had stolen her, yet also, in a strange way, saved her. He sighed, running a hand through his thick, dark hair. "I was born into a life of violence," he began. "My father was an outlaw, a leader of a gang that roamed these lands, raiding and pillaging. I grew up with a gun in my hand, learning to kill before I learned to read." Daisy listened in silence, her heart aching for the boy he'd been, the child robbed of innocence. She could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of the memories he carried. "I tried to leave that life," he continued, his voice laced with bitterness. "I wanted something different, something cleaner. But the past has a way of catching up with you. They killed the woman I loved, a woman as gentle and kind as you are, Daisy. They killed her because of me, because of who I was." The raw grief in his voice was palpable. Daisy reached out, her hand instinctively covering his. His skin was warm and rough, his fingers calloused from years of hard living. He didn't pull away, but his hand trembled slightly under hers. "I'm sorry, Rhett," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She understood now. The darkness that haunted him, the reason he lived on the edge, the reason he'd chosen a life of violence. He was driven by revenge, by a need to avenge the death of the woman he'd loved. He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a pain so profound it took her breath away. "She reminded me of you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "That's why I couldn't let you marry Thompson. I couldn't let you waste your life on a man you didn't love, a man who wouldn't appreciate you." His words, spoken with such raw honesty, sent a wave of emotion through her. She realized, with a sudden clarity, that his actions weren't just about revenge, or about some abstract notion of freedom. They were about her. He'd seen something in her, a spark of something he'd lost, and he'd risked everything to save her from a fate he believed she didn't deserve. She squeezed his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "Thank you, Rhett," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For seeing me, for saving me." He didn't reply, but his grip on her hand tightened. The silence that fell between them was no longer strained, but filled with a shared understanding, a connection forged in the crucible of their shared pain. The shadows of the past still lingered, but for the first time, Daisy felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that perhaps, together, they could find a way to outrun the darkness and find a light of their own. The fire crackled, a silent witness to the unspoken vows being forged between them. A coyote howled, mournful, yet somehow it echoed with a note of promise. Chapter 5. The Outlaw's Hidden Heart. The days following Rhett's confession brought a subtle shift in their relationship. The unspoken tension between them didn't disappear entirely, but it was softened by a newfound understanding, a shared vulnerability. Daisy began to see beyond the outlaw facade, to the man beneath, the man who had suffered, who had loved, who had lost. Rhett, in turn, seemed to relax his guard, allowing her glimpses of his hidden heart. He was still taciturn, still prone to brooding silences, but he also showed a gentler side, a tenderness that surprised and moved her. He would bring her wildflowers he'd found growing in unexpected places, their delicate beauty a stark contrast to the harshness of the landscape. He would share stories of his childhood, not the violent ones, but the rare moments of joy and laughter, the memories of a mother he'd loved and lost too soon. One afternoon, they came across a small, secluded oasis, a hidden spring surrounded by lush vegetation. It was a haven of peace and tranquility, a stark contrast to the arid plains they'd been traversing. Rhett decided to make camp there, giving the horses a much-needed rest. Daisy wandered down to the spring, drawn by the sound of running water. She knelt by the edge, cupping her hands and drinking deeply of the cool, clear water. It was the most refreshing thing she'd tasted in days. She heard a soft footstep behind her and turned to see Rhett standing there, watching her. He had a gentle smile on his face, a rare expression that transformed his features, making him look younger, almost boyish. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice soft, devoid of its usual gruffness. "Yes," she agreed, her gaze meeting his. "It's like a secret garden, hidden away from the world." He sat down beside her, their shoulders almost touching. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the gentle murmur of the spring, the rustling of the leaves in the breeze. It was a moment of perfect peace, a respite from the dangers and uncertainties of their journey. "I used to come to places like this with Sarah," Rhett said suddenly, his voice tinged with sadness. Sarah was the name of the woman he'd lost, the woman whose memory haunted him. Daisy didn't speak, simply waited for him to continue. "She loved nature," he said. "She found beauty in everything, even in the smallest things. She taught me to see the world differently, to appreciate the things I'd always taken for granted." He picked up a small, smooth stone and turned it over in his hands, his gaze fixed on its surface. "She would have loved this place," he said softly. Daisy felt a pang of sympathy for him, for the loss he'd endured. She also felt a flicker of something else, something she couldn't quite name. Jealousy, perhaps? Or maybe it was simply a longing for a love as deep and enduring as the one he'd shared with Sarah. "You still love her, don't you?" she asked quietly. He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a complex mix of emotions. "Yes," he admitted. "I'll always love her. But—" he hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. "But—" she prompted gently. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "But love doesn't always mean forever, Daisy," he said. "Sometimes, it's just a moment, a fleeting spark of light in the darkness. And sometimes, you have to let go of the past to make room for the future." His words resonated deeply within her. She understood what he was saying about the need to move on, to embrace the possibility of new beginnings. But she also wondered if he was truly ready to do that, if he could ever fully escape the shadow of Sarah's memory. She reached out, her hand gently touching his arm. "It's okay to grieve, Rhett," she said. "It's okay to remember. But it's also okay to live, to find happiness again." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. He didn't speak, but his gaze held a question, a vulnerability that made her heart ache. She saw a flicker of something else, Two, a spark of hope, a glimmer of desire. He leaned closer, his hand reaching up to cup her cheek. His touch was gentle, tentative, as if he were afraid of breaking something fragile. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, suspended in a space between the past and the future. The air crackled with unspoken emotions, with the possibility of something new, something more. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers, a feather-light touch that sent a shiver of anticipation through her. Then, just as quickly, he pulled back, his eyes clouded with uncertainty. The sound of a hawk circling overhead broke the spell, a reminder of the wild, unpredictable world that surrounded them. Chapter 6. Echoes in the Canyon. The near kiss at the oasis hung between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the growing attraction that neither of them could deny. It changed things, subtly but profoundly. Their interactions became charged with a new awareness, a heightened sensitivity to each other's presence. They were still outlaw and captive, but the lines were blurring, the boundaries shifting. They continued their journey, heading towards the rugged mountains that loomed on the horizon. The terrain grew more challenging, the landscape more desolate. They spoke less, their communication often limited to practical necessities, but their silences were no longer strained, but filled with a shared understanding, a silent language of glances and gestures. One evening, they found shelter in a narrow canyon, its walls rising steeply on either side, creating a sense of enclosure, of intimacy. The air was cool and still, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire Rhett had built. As they ate their meager meal, Daisy noticed Rhett staring into the flames, his expression troubled. He'd been unusually quiet all day, his usual guardedness amplified. "What is it, Rhett?" she asked softly, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He hesitated, as if debating whether to share his thoughts. "We're getting closer to Shadow Ridge," he said finally, his voice low and grim. Daisy knew the name. It was a notorious outlaw stronghold, a place of danger and violence. It was also, she suspected, a place connected to Rhett's past. "Is that where you're taking me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He shook his head. "No," he said. "I wouldn't take you there. It's too dangerous." But she saw the doubt in his eyes, the uncertainty that belied his words. She knew he was wrestling with something, a decision that weighed heavily on him. "What is it, then?" she pressed gently. "What's troubling you?" He sighed, running a hand through his thick, dark hair. "My past," he said. "It's catching up with me. There are people in Shadow Ridge, people I used to run with. People who won't be happy to see me." He paused, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "They know about Sarah," he continued. "They know I blamed them for her death. They'll be looking for me, wanting revenge." Daisy felt a chill run down her spine. She'd known their journey was dangerous, but she hadn't realized the full extent of the threat they faced. They weren't just running from Samuel Thompson and his posse, they were running from Rhett's former comrades, men who were just as ruthless and dangerous as he was. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "We're going to keep moving," he said. "We're going to stay ahead of them. I won't let them hurt you, Daisy. I promise you that." His words were meant to reassure her, but they also filled her with a sense of dread. She knew he would do everything in his power to protect her, but she also knew the odds were stacked against them. As they settled down for the night, Daisy couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The canyon walls seemed to close in on her, the silence amplifying every creak and groan of the rocks. She lay awake for hours, listening to Rhett's breathing, his occasional restless movements. She heard him mutter something in his sleep, a name. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice filled with pain. Daisy felt a pang of sympathy for him, for the ghosts that still haunted him. But she also felt a growing sense of resentment, a frustration that he couldn't seem to let go of the past. She was here, with him, now, risking her life for him, and yet he was still clinging to the memory of a woman he could never have back. As the first rays of dawn crept over the canyon walls, Daisy made a decision. She couldn't continue like this, living in the shadow of another woman's ghost. She needed to know where she stood, what future, if any, they had together. She got up and went to where Rhett was sitting, staring out at the sunrise. He turned as she approached, his eyes questioning. "We need to talk, Rhett," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her heart. "About us. About the future." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. The echoes of the canyon seemed to magnify the weight of her words, the uncertainty of their situation. The silence stretched, taut and fragile, like a rope stretched to its breaking point. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air between them as the sun continued its inexorable climb. Chapter 7. The Price of Freedom. Rhett's silence stretched, a palpable tension filling the narrow canyon. He looked at Daisy, his gaze searching, as if trying to decipher the emotions that flickered across her face. He knew this conversation was inevitable, that he couldn't keep running from the past, from the growing feelings he had for her. "What future can there be, Daisy?" he asked finally, his voice rough with a mixture of weariness and resignation. "I'm an outlaw, a man with a price on his head. You deserve better than that." "Don't tell me what I deserve," Daisy retorted, her voice sharper than she intended. "I chose to come with you, Rhett. I knew the risks." "You didn't choose," he corrected her, his voice hardening. "I took you. I stole you from your wedding, from a life that, while not what you wanted, was at least safe. And I'm grateful for that," Daisy insisted. "I was suffocating in Harmony Creek, Rhett. You gave me a chance to breathe, to live. But I can't live in the shadows, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if you're ever going to let go of the past." Her words struck him, a painful truth he couldn't deny. He had been clinging to Sarah's memory, using it as a shield against the possibility of future pain, of future loss. But in doing so, he'd been shutting Daisy out, denying her the chance to truly connect with him. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. His touch was tentative, as if he were afraid of breaking something fragile. "I know," he said softly. "I haven't been fair to you. I've been so focused on my own demons, I haven't seen you." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "I care about you, Daisy," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "More than I ever thought I could care about anyone again. But I'm afraid. Afraid of hurting you, afraid of losing you." His vulnerability touched her, melting away the last vestiges of her anger. She understood his fear, the weight of his past, the burden he carried. But she also saw the flicker of hope in his eyes, the desire for something more, something better. She placed her hand over his, her fingers intertwining with his. "We all have scars, Rhett," she said. "We all have things we regret. But we can't let the past define us. We have to choose to move forward, to embrace the possibility of happiness, even if it's fleeting." Her words resonated deeply within him. He'd been living in the past for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to live in the present, to embrace the possibility of a future. He looked at Daisy, at her strong, determined face, at the unwavering gaze that held both compassion and challenge, and he knew he couldn't let her go. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of her, a scent that had become as familiar and comforting as the smell of the desert after a rain. "I don't want to lose you, Daisy," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I don't know what the future holds, but I want to face it with you. By my side." Daisy clung to him, her heart overflowing with a mixture of relief and trepidation. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, that they would face dangers and challenges, but she also knew that she was no longer alone. She had Rhett, and he had her. And that, she realized, was all that mattered. They stayed in the canyon for another day, resting and regrouping. Rhett made a decision. He wouldn't run anymore. He would face his past, confront his former comrades, and clear his name, as much as that was possible. It was a risky plan, a dangerous gamble, but he knew it was the only way to secure a future for himself and Daisy. He told her his plan, outlining the risks, the potential consequences. He gave her the option to leave, to go her own way, to find a safe haven. "I won't force you to stay with me, Daisy," he said. "If you want to go, I'll understand." But Daisy didn't hesitate. "I'm not leaving you, Rhett," she said firmly. "We're in this together. Until the end." Her words, spoken with such unwavering conviction, filled him with a sense of gratitude and determination. He would fight for her, for their future, for the chance to finally escape the shadows of his past. They rode out of the canyon late that day, leaving their temporary sanctuary to embrace an uncertain future. Chapter 8. Under a Sky of Secrets. The journey to Shadow Ridge was fraught with tension. The closer they got, the more guarded Rhett became, his senses on high alert. He knew they were entering dangerous territory, a place where his past could literally come back to haunt him. He avoided the main trails, sticking to hidden paths and obscure routes, constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. Daisy, despite her fear, remained steadfastly by his side. She had grown stronger, more resilient, during their time together. The sheltered, naive woman who had stood at the altar in Harmony Creek was gone, replaced by a woman of the West, capable and resourceful. She had learned to ride, to shoot, to survive. And she had learned to love, to trust, even in the face of danger. The landscape reflected their inner turmoil. The rolling plains gave way to jagged mountains, the open skies replaced by towering cliffs and narrow canyons. The weather turned volatile, with sudden storms sweeping across the landscape, mirroring the emotional storms raging within them. One evening, as they camped under a vast, star-studded sky, Daisy noticed Rhett staring up at the heavens, his expression troubled. The stars were incredibly bright, a million pinpricks of light against the inky blackness. It was a beautiful sight, but Rhett seemed to find no solace in it. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly, sitting down beside him. He sighed, his gaze still fixed on the stars. "I'm thinking about all the choices I've made," he said. "All the mistakes. I've lived a life of violence, Daisy. I've done things I'm not proud of." "We all have regrets, Rhett," she reminded him. "You can't change the past, but you can choose to be different now." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "Can you ever truly forgive me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "For taking you, for putting you in danger?" Daisy reached out, her hand gently touching his cheek. "There's nothing to forgive, Rhett," she said. "You saved me. You showed me a different way to live. I wouldn't be here, the woman I am now, if it weren't for you." Her words, spoken with such sincerity, touched him deeply. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a moment. He had carried the weight of his guilt for so long. He'd forgotten what it felt like to be forgiven, to be accepted. He opened his eyes and looked at her, his gaze filled with a mixture of gratitude and longing. "I don't deserve you, Daisy," he said. "But I'm not going to let you go." He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. He kissed her then, under the vast, starlit sky. A kiss that was both passionate and tender, a kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment to each other. It was a kiss that spoke of forgiveness, of acceptance, of a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. But even as they clung to each other, seeking solace in each other's arms, the secrets of Shadow Ridge loomed, a dark cloud on the horizon. They knew their journey was far from over, that they would soon have to face Rhett's past and the consequences of his choices. The next morning, they rode in silence, the tension between them palpable. They were getting closer to Shadow Ridge, and the anticipation was almost unbearable. Daisy could see the worry in Rhett's eyes, the constant scanning of the horizon, the tightening of his jaw. As they rounded a bend in the trail, they saw it. Shadow Ridge, a cluster of ramshackle buildings nestled in a hidden valley, surrounded by towering cliffs. It was a desolate, forbidding place, a haven for outlaws and desperados. Rhett stopped his horse, his gaze fixed on the town below. "This is it," he said, his voice grim. "This is where it all began. And this is where it ends." Daisy felt a knot of fear tighten in her chest. She knew this was the moment of truth, the moment they would have to face the ghosts of Rhett's past. She looked at him, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. "We're ready," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "We'll face it together." He nodded, his gaze meeting hers. He reached out, his hand taking hers. Their fingers intertwined, a silent vow of solidarity, of unwavering support. The secrets of Shadow Ridge, whispered on the wind like a threat and a promise, awaited them. A hawk circled overhead, a silent omen against the vast, unforgiving sky. Chapter 9. A Dance with Danger. The descent into Shadow Ridge was like entering a different world. The air grew thick with a palpable sense of menace, the silence broken only by the occasional raucous laughter or the discordant notes of a saloon piano. The buildings were weathered and dilapidated, their facades scarred with bullet holes and signs of neglect. The faces of the inhabitants were hardened and suspicious, their eyes narrowed with distrust. Rhett rode with a tense alertness, his hand never far from his revolver. He knew he was walking into a trap, that his former comrades would be waiting for him, eager to settle old scores. But he had no choice. He had to face them, to clear his name as much as that was possible, and to secure a future for himself and Daisy. He chose to bypass the main street, opting instead for a less conspicuous back alley. The shadows offered a degree of concealment, but they also amplified the sense of danger, the feeling of being watched. As they reached the rear of the largest saloon, the Serpent's Tooth, Red dismounted and motioned for Daisy to do the same. He tied the horses to a rickety post, his movements quick and efficient. "Stay close to me," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the din of the saloon. "And don't trust anyone." Daisy nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never felt so afraid, so out of her element. But she trusted Rhett, and she would follow him, even into the heart of darkness. They entered the saloon through a side door, stepping into a dimly lit, smoke-filled room. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and cheap tobacco. The room was crowded with rough-looking men, gamblers, outlaws, and the women who catered to their needs. All eyes turned towards them as they entered, their gazes hostile and suspicious. Rhett scanned the room, his eyes searching for familiar faces. He saw them immediately. 3 men, sitting at a table in the back, their faces contorted with a mixture of surprise and anger. They were his former comrades, the men he had ridden with, the men he had betrayed. The leader of the group, a burly man with a scarred face and a cold, cruel smile, rose to his feet. Well, he drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look who's decided to grace us with his presence. Rhett Callahan, back from the dead." Rhett didn't reply, his gaze fixed on the man's face. He knew this confrontation was inevitable, that he would have to fight for his life, for his freedom. "We heard you stole yourself a bride," the man continued, his eyes flickering towards Daisy. "A pretty little thing. Too good for the likes of you, Callahan." Daisy felt a shiver of fear run down her spine, but she stood her ground, her hand instinctively reaching for the small knife Rhett had given her, hidden in her boot. "Leave her out of this, Bart," Rhett said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is between you and me." Bart laughed, a harsh, guttural sound. "Everything you have is ours, Callahan," he said. "Including your woman." He nodded to his companions, and they rose to their feet, their hands moving towards their weapons. The room fell silent, the tension thick and suffocating. Everyone was watching, waiting for the inevitable explosion of violence. Rhett knew he was outnumbered, outgunned. But he had one advantage. He had Daisy. And he would fight to the death to protect her. He pushed Daisy behind him, shielding her with his body. "Stay back," he whispered. "And be ready to run." He drew his revolver, the movement swift and fluid. The click of the hammer echoed in the silence, a prelude to the storm that was about to break. Bart and his men also drew their weapons, the glint of steel reflecting the dim light of the saloon. The air crackled with anticipation, with the imminent threat of violence. "It doesn't have to be this way, Rhett," Bart said, his voice still laced with sarcasm. "Join us again. We can be brothers again." "We were never brothers, Bart," Rhett replied, his voice cold and hard. "You're nothing but a bunch of murderers and thieves." Bart's smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure hatred. "Then die like one," he snarled. He fired his gun, the shot echoing like a thunderclap in the confined space. The battle had begun. It was a dance with danger, a desperate fight for survival in the heart of the outlaw town. The outcome remained uncertain, suspended in the smoky air, like the fate of their love, hanging precariously in the balance. Chapter 10. The Sheriff's Relentless Pursuit. The saloon erupted in chaos. Gunshots rang out, shattering glass and splintering wood. Men shouted, women screamed, and the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Daisy, pressed against the wall behind Rhett, watched in horror as he engaged in a deadly duel with Bart and his men. Rhett moved with a speed and agility she hadn't known he possessed. He was a natural gunslinger, his movements fluid and precise. He ducked and weaved, dodging bullets, returning fire with deadly accuracy. But he was outnumbered. Bart and his two companions were relentless, pressing their attack, forcing Rhett to retreat further into the saloon. Daisy knew he couldn't hold them off forever. She saw an opportunity. One of Bart's men, momentarily separated from the others, was reloading his weapon. Daisy acted instinctively. She pulled the knife from her boot, the cold steel a comforting weight in her hand. She lunged forward, surprising the man with her sudden attack. She stabbed him in the arm, the blade sinking deep into his flesh. He cried out in pain, dropping his gun. Daisy didn't hesitate. She kicked the gun away, out of his reach. Rhett, seeing her intervention, took advantage of the distraction. He shot Bart in the leg, sending him sprawling to the floor. The remaining outlaw, seeing his comrades wounded, hesitated, his resolve faltering. Rhett seized the moment. He disarmed the man, holding him at gunpoint. The fighting stopped, the silence broken only by the groans of the wounded and the heavy breathing of the combatants. "It's over," Rhett said, his voice cold and hard. "Drop your weapon." Bart, clutching his wounded leg, glared at Rhett with pure hatred. But he knew he was defeated. He slowly lowered his gun, letting it clatter to the floor. Just as it seemed the confrontation was over, a new voice shattered the tense silence. "Hold it right there, Callahan." The voice came from the entrance of the saloon. A tall, imposing figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, his badge gleaming in the dim light. It was Sheriff Thompson, Samuel's older brother, the lawman who had been relentlessly pursuing them. Daisy felt a surge of despair. They had survived the shootout with Bart and his men, only to be confronted by another, even more formidable threat. Sheriff Thompson strode into the saloon, his deputies flanking him, their guns drawn. He surveyed the scene, his gaze taking in the wounded outlaws, the scattered weapons, the defiant figure of Rhett Callahan. "You're under arrest, Callahan," Thompson said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "For kidnapping, assault, and a whole host of other crimes." Rhett didn't lower his gun. He knew Thompson wouldn't hesitate to shoot him, given the chance. "I didn't kidnap Daisy," Rhett said, his voice steady, despite the tremor in his heart. "She came with me willingly." Thompson's gaze shifted to Daisy, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Is that true, Miss Tate?" he asked. Daisy hesitated. She knew her answer could determine Rhett's fate. She could lie, claim she'd been kidnapped, and perhaps save herself. But she couldn't betray Rhett, the man she had come to love. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "It's true. I went with Rhett willingly. I didn't want to marry Samuel." Thompson's expression hardened. "You're a fool, Miss Tate," he said. "You've thrown your life away for an outlaw." "I made my choice," Daisy replied, her gaze meeting his defiantly. Thompson turned back to Rhett. "It doesn't matter," he said. "You're still under arrest." He motioned to his deputies, and they moved forward, their guns trained on Rhett. Rhett knew he couldn't fight them all. He was trapped, cornered, his dream of a future with Daisy slipping away. He looked at Daisy, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and love. He had tried to protect her, to give her a better life, but he had failed. The relentless pursuit of the law, like the weight of his past, had finally caught up with him. The echo of the gunshots still seemed to hang in the air, a grim reminder of the choices that had led them to this desperate impasse. Chapter 11. Trials by Firelight. Rhett lowered his revolver, a gesture of surrender that felt like a betrayal of everything he'd fought for. He allowed Thompson's deputies to disarm him, the cold steel of their handcuffs a stark symbol of his captivity. Daisy watched, her heart breaking, feeling a wave of helplessness wash over her. "Take him away," Thompson ordered, his voice devoid of any emotion. He turned to Daisy, his gaze hardening. "As for you, Miss Tate, you'll be coming with me back to Harmony Creek." Daisy didn't argue, didn't resist. She knew it was futile. She had made her choice, and now she had to face the consequences. She had chosen love over security, freedom over obligation, and now she was paying the price. As Rhett was being led away, their eyes met. There was a silent exchange between them, a mixture of love, regret, and a desperate hope that somehow, someday, they would be together again. It was a promise, unspoken but deeply felt, a bond that even prison bars couldn't break. Daisy was escorted back to Harmony Creek, a journey that felt like a lifetime. The landscape that had once seemed so exhilarating, so full of promise, now appeared bleak and desolate, reflecting the emptiness in her heart. She was returned to her father's ranch, a place that now felt like a prison. Her father, his face etched with disappointment and anger, barely acknowledged her presence. He had lost everything, his chance to secure the ranch, his daughter's reputation, all because of her reckless decision. Samuel, surprisingly, was more forgiving. He still wanted to marry her, to offer her a life of security and stability. He believed he could save her, redeem her from the taint of her association with Rhett Callahan. "I understand, Daisy," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You were confused, manipulated by that outlaw. But it's not too late. We can still have a future together." Daisy looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and gratitude. He was a good man, a kind man, but she couldn't marry him. She didn't love him. Her heart belonged to Rhett, to the outlaw who had stolen her, yet also, in a strange way, set her free. She refused Samuel's offer, gently but firmly. She couldn't pretend, couldn't live a lie. She would rather face the scorn of the community, the hardship of an uncertain future, than betray the love she felt for Rhett. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Daisy lived a quiet, solitary life, working on the ranch, helping her father as much as she could. She was ostracized by the community, treated as an outcast, a woman who had disgraced herself and her family. But she didn't care. She held on to the memory of Rhett, to the love they had shared, to the hope that somehow, someday, they would be reunited. One evening, as she sat by the fire, lost in thought, she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find a stranger standing there, a weathered old man with kind eyes and a knowing smile. "Are you Daisy Tate?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, her heart beating faster. He handed her a small, folded piece of paper. "This is for you," he said. "From a friend." Daisy unfolded the paper, her hands trembling. It was a letter, written in Rhett's familiar scrawl. "Daisy," it read, "I'm alive. I escaped. I'm coming for you. Wait for me. Rhett." Tears welled up in Daisy's eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of renewed hope. He was alive. He was coming back for her. Their trials were far from over, but she knew, with a certainty that burned brighter than any fire, that their love would endure. The night was suddenly filled with promise, with the whispered hope of reunion, with the unwavering belief that their journey, though fraught with danger, would ultimately lead them back to each other. The crackling fire seemed to dance with a newfound energy, reflecting the rekindled flame of hope in her heart. Chapter 12. Scars of Yesterday. Rhett's escape had been a daring and improbable feat, aided by an unexpected ally, a grizzled old prospector named Jedediah, who had a long-standing grudge against Sheriff Thompson and a soft spot for star-crossed lovers. Jedediah had helped Rhett evade the posse, providing him with a horse, supplies, and a safe passage through the treacherous mountain trails. But Rhett was wounded, both physically and emotionally. The shootout in Shadow Ridge had left him with a bullet graze on his side, a constant reminder of the violence he'd endured. And the memory of Daisy's face, as he was being led away in handcuffs, haunted him day and night. He knew he had to be careful. Sheriff Thompson would be relentless in his pursuit, and the bounty on Rhett's head had increased, making him a target for every two-bit outlaw and bounty hunter in the territory. He traveled under the cover of darkness, avoiding towns and settlements, sticking to the wilderness. He lived off the land, hunting and foraging for food, sleeping under the stars. He was a fugitive, a man on the run, but he was driven by a single, unwavering purpose: to get back to Daisy. As he journeyed, he began to reflect on his past, on the choices he'd made, on the life he'd lived. He realized he couldn't keep running forever, that he needed to find a way to clear his name, to escape the shadow of his outlaw past. He decided to seek out the one person who might be able to help him: Judge Parker, a legendary lawman known for his fairness and his unwavering commitment to justice. Parker was a man of integrity, a man who believed in redemption, a man who might be willing to give Rhett a second chance. Finding Judge Parker was no easy task. The judge was a recluse, living in a remote cabin high in the mountains. But Rhett was determined. He followed rumors and whispers, tracking the judge like a seasoned hunter. Finally, after weeks of searching, he found him. The judge, a tall, imposing figure with a stern face and piercing blue eyes, greeted him with suspicion, his hand never far from his rifle. Rhett explained his situation, telling the judge his story, his past, his relationship with Daisy, his desire to change his life. He didn't try to excuse his actions, but he pleaded for a chance to prove he was no longer the man he used to be. Judge Parker listened intently, his gaze unwavering. He asked probing questions, testing Rhett's sincerity, his commitment to change. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice grave. "You've done wrong, Callahan," he said. "You've broken the law, caused pain and suffering. But I also see something in you, a spark of something good, a desire for redemption." The judge paused, his gaze fixed on Rhett. "I'm willing to give you a chance," he said. "But it won't be easy. You'll have to prove yourself. You'll have to face your past, confront your enemies, and earn your freedom." Rhett nodded, his heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and trepidation. He knew the judge's offer was a long shot, a gamble, but it was the only chance he had. "I'm ready," Rhett said, his voice firm. "I'll do whatever it takes." Judge Parker outlined his plan. Rhett would have to gather evidence, find witnesses, expose the corruption of Sheriff Thompson and the illegal activities of Bart and his gang. It was a dangerous mission, a near impossible task, but Rhett was determined to succeed. He set off, leaving the judge's cabin with a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just a fugitive, a man on the run. He was a man on a mission, a man fighting for his freedom, for his future, for his love. The scars of yesterday, both physical and emotional, were still there, but they no longer defined him. They were a reminder of the past he was determined to leave behind, a testament to the man he was striving to become. The journey ahead would be arduous, but he faced it with a newfound courage, fueled by the hope of a future with Daisy. The distant mountains, shrouded in mist, seemed to beckon him, a symbol of the challenges he would face and the ultimate reward that awaited him. Chapter 13. Between Two Worlds. Daisy, meanwhile, found herself caught between two worlds. She was living in the familiar surroundings of her father's ranch, but her heart was with Rhett, out in the wilderness, fighting for his freedom. She was surrounded by the people of Harmony Creek, but she felt like an outsider, a stranger in her own home. She went through the motions of daily life, helping her father with the chores, tending to the animals, but her mind was elsewhere. She constantly scanned the horizon, hoping to catch a glimpse of Rhett, praying for his safe return. She received occasional messages from him, smuggled to her by Jedediah, the old prospector who had become their unlikely ally. The messages were brief, cryptic, but they were enough to keep her hope alive, to reassure her that he was still out there, fighting for their future. She also faced constant pressure from Samuel and his family. They hadn't given up on the idea of a marriage between her and Samuel, believing it was the only way to restore her reputation and secure the future of both families. "Daisy, you need to think about your future," Clara, Samuel's sister, told her one day. "You can't live in the past, clinging to the memory of an outlaw. Samuel is a good man, a kind man. He loves you. He can give you a good life." Daisy appreciated Clara's concern, but she couldn't be swayed. "I don't love Samuel, Clara," she said gently. "My heart belongs to Rhett. I can't marry a man I don't love, no matter how good or kind he is." Clara sighed, shaking her head. "You're making a mistake, Daisy," she said. "You're throwing your life away for a dream, a fantasy." Daisy knew Clara was right in a way. Her love for Rhett was a risky proposition, a gamble with uncertain odds. But it was a gamble she was willing to take. She would rather live a life of uncertainty, of danger, with the man she loved, than a life of security and comfort with a man she didn't. She found solace in the small things, in the beauty of the landscape, in the quiet moments she spent alone, remembering Rhett, replaying their time together in her mind. She would often ride out to the spot where he had first taken her, the hidden canyon where they had shared their first tentative kiss. She would sit there, under the vast, starlit sky, feeling his presence, imagining him beside her. She also began to take a more active role in her own life. She started to learn more about the running of the ranch, taking on responsibilities that her father had previously handled. She became more independent, more assertive, more like the woman Rhett had seen in her, the woman he had helped her become. She was no longer the sheltered, naive girl who had stood at the altar in Harmony Creek. She was a woman of the West, strong, resilient, and capable. She was a woman who knew what she wanted and who was willing to fight for it. She was caught between two worlds, the world of her past, of duty and obligation, and the world of her future, of love and freedom. But she was no longer torn. She had made her choice. She had chosen Rhett, and she would stand by him, no matter what the cost. She knew the challenges would be numerous, the path ahead, winding and difficult. A hawk's cry pierced the air, sharp as it was. It couldn't penetrate the newfound resolve growing in her heart. Chapter 14. A Glimmer of Hope. Rhett's quest to clear his name was proving to be more difficult than he'd anticipated. Gathering evidence against Sheriff Thompson and Bart's gang was a dangerous and painstaking process. People were afraid to talk, intimidated by Thompson's power and the gang's ruthlessness. But Rhett was persistent. He followed every lead, tracked down every rumor, slowly piecing together the puzzle of Thompson's corruption. He discovered that Thompson was involved in a wide range of illegal activities, from cattle rustling to land grabbing, using his position as sheriff to enrich himself and his cronies. He also found evidence linking Bart's gang to several unsolved robberies and murders, crimes that Thompson had conveniently overlooked or covered up. He managed to persuade a few key witnesses to come forward, promising them protection and anonymity. These were people who had been wronged by Thompson and Bart, people who were seeking justice, people who were willing to risk their lives to tell the truth. One of the most important witnesses was a former deputy of Thompson's, a man named Miller, who had been forced out of his job for refusing to participate in Thompson's illegal activities. Miller had kept detailed records of Thompson's dealings, documenting the sheriff's corruption and his collusion with Bart's gang. Another key witness was a young woman named Sarah, a different Sarah, bearing the same name but not the ghost of his past, who had been robbed and assaulted by Bart's gang, a crime that Thompson had ignored. Sarah was traumatized but determined to see justice done. Rhett knew he needed to get this evidence to Judge Parker, but he also knew that Thompson would be watching him closely, waiting for an opportunity to silence him permanently. He decided to send a message to Daisy, asking her to meet him at a secret rendezvous point, a remote cabin high in the mountains. He knew it was risky, but he needed to see her, to tell her what he discovered, to reassure her that he was making progress. He entrusted the message to Jedediah, the old prospector who had helped him escape. Jedediah, despite his gruff exterior, had become a loyal friend and ally, a man who believed in Rhett's cause. Daisy received the message with a mixture of joy and trepidation. She was thrilled to hear from Rhett, to know that he was alive and well, but she also worried about the risks he was taking. She didn't hesitate. She packed a small bag, saddled her horse, and set off for the rendezvous point, leaving a note for her father, telling him she would be back soon. The journey was arduous, the terrain treacherous, but Daisy was driven by her love for Rhett, by her unwavering belief in his innocence. She reached the cabin late in the evening, her heart pounding with anticipation. She saw him standing there, waiting for her, his silhouette outlined against the setting sun. They rushed into each other's arms, holding each other tight, as if they would never let go. It was a moment of pure joy, of reunion, of a love that had endured despite the distance, the danger, the uncertainty. "I missed you so much," Rhett whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I missed you too," Daisy replied, her tears flowing freely. They spent the night in the cabin, sharing their stories, catching up on everything that had happened since they'd last been together. Rhett told her about his quest to clear his name, about the evidence he'd gathered, about the witnesses he'd found. Daisy told him about her life in Harmony Creek, about the pressure she was facing from Samuel and his family, about her growing independence and determination. They made love, their passion fueled by their separation, by their shared love, by their unwavering hope for a future together. It was a moment of intimacy, of connection, of a bond that had been tested but not broken. As the dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, a renewed sense of hope filled the small cabin. They were together again, even if only for a brief time. And they had a plan, a glimmer of hope that they could finally escape the shadows of the past and build a future together. The crisp mountain air seemed to carry a promise, a whisper of a new beginning, fragile yet potent. Chapter 15. The Ties That Bind. Their reunion, though sweet, was brief. Rhett knew he couldn't stay long. He had to get the evidence to Judge Parker, and he had to do it before Sheriff Thompson discovered his whereabouts. "I have to go, Daisy," he said, his voice filled with regret. "But I'll be back. I promise you." "I know," Daisy replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Be careful, Rhett. Please." He kissed her one last time, a lingering kiss that spoke of their love, their commitment, their unwavering hope for a future together. He rode off, disappearing into the morning mist, leaving Daisy alone in the cabin, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready to face it. She had Rhett's love, and that was all that mattered. She returned to Harmony Creek, her resolve strengthened by her reunion with Rhett. She was no longer afraid of Sheriff Thompson, of Samuel, of the community's judgment. She was determined to fight for Rhett, to help him clear his name, to secure their future together. She began to gather her own evidence, subtly questioning the people of Harmony Creek, seeking out those who had been wronged by Thompson and Bart. She discovered that many people were afraid to speak out, intimidated by Thompson's power and the gang's ruthlessness. But she also found a few brave souls who were willing to share their stories, to provide her with information that could help Rhett. She learned that Thompson had been systematically cheating people out of their land, using his position as sheriff to manipulate property records and force people off their farms and ranches. She also discovered that he had been protecting Bart's gang in exchange for a share of their ill-gotten gains. She documented everything, carefully collecting the evidence, preparing to present it to Judge Parker when the time was right. She also had to deal with Samuel, who continued to press his suit. He couldn't understand her loyalty to Rhett, her refusal to accept his offer of marriage. "Daisy, you're throwing your life away," he told her one day, his voice filled with frustration. "Rhett Callahan is an outlaw, a criminal. He'll never change. He'll never be able to give you a decent life." "You're wrong, Samuel," Daisy replied, her voice firm. "Rhett is a good man, a man who has been wronged. He's fighting for his freedom, for his future. And I'm going to stand by him, no matter what." Samuel shook his head, his expression a mixture of pity and disappointment. "You're a fool, Daisy," he said. "You're blinded by love. You can't see the truth." Daisy didn't argue. She knew Samuel couldn't understand her love for Rhett, the bond that tied them together. It was a bond forged in adversity, in shared danger, in a mutual desire for freedom and justice. As the days passed, Daisy grew increasingly anxious. She hadn't heard from Rhett in weeks, and she worried that something had happened to him. She knew he was taking enormous risks, and she feared for his safety. Then, one evening, she received a message from Jedediah. It was brief and to the point. "Meet me at the old mill. Midnight."
Urgent.
Daisy's heart pounded with anticipation. She knew this was it. The time had come to confront Sheriff Thompson, to expose his corruption, to clear Rhett's name. The ties that bound her to Rhett, to their shared past and their hoped-for future, felt stronger than ever. The night was heavy with uncertainty, but a sliver of moon peeked through the clouds, a silent promise of the dawn that might yet come. Chapter 16. Unveiling the Truth. The old mill, a decaying relic of Harmony Creek's past, stood on the outskirts of town, a shadowy silhouette against the night sky. It was a place of secrets, of whispered conversations, of clandestine meetings. It was the perfect place for a confrontation. Daisy arrived at midnight, her heart pounding in her chest. She was armed with the evidence she had gathered, the testimonies of the people who had been wronged by Sheriff Thompson and Bart's gang. She was also armed with her courage, her determination, her unwavering love for Rhett. Jedediah was waiting for her, his weathered face grim. "He's here," he said, his voice low. "Judge Parker." "And so is Thompson." Daisy felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. The moment of truth. They entered the mill, stepping into a dimly lit, cavernous space. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. The only light came from a few flickering lanterns, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. Judge Parker stood in the center of the room, his tall, imposing figure radiating authority. He was surrounded by a small group of men, his trusted deputies, their faces grim and determined. Sheriff Thompson stood opposite him, his expression a mixture of arrogance and defiance. He was also accompanied by his deputies, their hands hovering near their weapons. Rhett was nowhere to be seen. "Where is he?" Daisy asked Jedediah, her voice trembling. "He's coming," Jedediah replied. "He's bringing the final piece of the puzzle." Judge Parker addressed Thompson, his voice stern and unwavering. "Sheriff Thompson," he said, "you are accused of corruption, abuse of power, and collusion with outlaws. I have evidence to support these charges, and witnesses who are willing to testify against you." Thompson scoffed. "You have nothing, Parker," he said. "These are just the lies of disgruntled citizens, manipulated by that outlaw, Callahan." "The evidence speaks for itself, Thompson," Parker replied. "And so will the witnesses." He motioned to Daisy, and she stepped forward, holding out the documents she had collected. "These are the testimonies of the people you have wronged, Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "People you have cheated, robbed, and intimidated." Thompson's face turned pale. He hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated that Daisy would be involved. Judge Parker began to read the evidence, detailing Thompson's crimes, his abuse of power, his collusion with Bart's gang. The room was silent, the tension thick and suffocating. Just as Parker was finishing, the sound of horses' hooves echoed outside. The doors of the mill burst open, and Rhett rode in, his face grim and determined. He was accompanied by a group of men, the witnesses he had gathered, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and resolve. Thompson's eyes widened in disbelief. He had underestimated Rhett, underestimated his determination, his resourcefulness. "It's over," Rhett said, his voice cold and hard. "Your reign of terror is finished." Thompson's deputies, seeing the overwhelming evidence against their boss, began to back down. They had no desire to die for a corrupt sheriff. Thompson, realizing he was cornered, made one last desperate move. He drew his gun, aiming it at Rhett, but Rhett was faster. He fired his own weapon, the shot echoing in the confined space. Thompson crumpled to the ground, his gun falling from his hand. The confrontation was over. The truth had been unveiled. Justice had been served. The weight of the past, The secrets that had haunted them were finally brought to light. The silence that followed was broken only by the ragged breathing of those present, a collective exhale after a long-held breath. Chapter 17. Reckoning at Red Rock. The aftermath of the confrontation at the mill was swift and decisive. Sheriff Thompson, though wounded, was arrested, along with his remaining loyal deputies. Bart and his surviving gang members, who had been hiding nearby, were also apprehended, their reign of terror finally brought to an end. Judge Parker, true to his word, took charge of the situation. He ensured that Thompson and his accomplices would face a fair trial, that the witnesses would be protected, and that justice would be served. Rhett, though cleared of the most serious charges, still had to answer for his past actions. But Judge Parker, recognizing Rhett's genuine remorse and his efforts to expose Thompson's corruption, offered him a deal. "Callahan," the judge said, "you've done wrong, but you've also done good. I'm willing to offer you a pardon, on one condition. You must agree to work for me as a special investigator. You'll use your skills, your knowledge of the outlaw world, to help me bring other criminals to justice." Rhett didn't hesitate. He accepted the judge's offer, grateful for the chance to redeem himself, to use his skills for good, to build a new life. Daisy, overjoyed at Rhett's pardon, stood by his side, her love and support unwavering. She had faced her own trials, her own challenges, and she had emerged stronger, more resilient, more determined than ever. The news of Thompson's arrest and Rhett's pardon spread quickly through Harmony Creek. The community, initially shocked and divided, began to realize the truth, that they had been living under the rule of a corrupt sheriff, that Rhett Callahan was not the villain they had believed him to be. Samuel Thompson, to his credit, accepted Daisy's decision with grace. He realized he couldn't force her to love him, that her heart belonged to Rhett. He released her from any obligation, wishing her well, even offering his support to Rhett. "I was wrong about you, Callahan," Samuel admitted. "You're a better man than I gave you credit for. Take care of Daisy. She deserves happiness." Rhett and Daisy decided to leave Harmony Creek, to start a new life together, away from the shadows of the past. They chose to settle in Red Rock, a small, peaceful town nestled in the foothills of the mountains, a place where they could build a future, a place where they could finally be free. They bought a small ranch, a modest spread of land with a cozy cabin, surrounded by rolling hills and towering pines. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. It was a place where they could build a home, a family, a life together. They worked hard, side by side, building their ranch, raising cattle, tending to the land. They found joy in the simple things, in the beauty of the landscape, in the quiet companionship, in the love that bound them together. Rhett, true to his word, worked as a special investigator for Judge Parker, using his skills to track down outlaws and bring them to justice. He was no longer a man on the run, but a man of the law, a man dedicated to upholding justice and protecting the innocent. Daisy, meanwhile, found fulfillment in her new life. She was no longer the sheltered, naive girl who had been forced to marry a man she didn't love. She was a woman of the West, strong, independent, and capable. She was a wife, a partner, a woman deeply in love. The reckoning at Red Rock was not just about confronting their enemies, about exposing corruption, about clearing Rhett's name. It was about finding peace, about building a future, about embracing the love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. The setting sun, casting long shadows across their new land, painted a picture of hope, of a new beginning, of a love that had endured the trials of the past and emerged stronger, more resilient, more enduring than ever. A gentle breeze whispered through the trees, carrying the promise of a peaceful future. Chapter 18. The Heart's True Compass. Life in Red Rock settled into a comfortable rhythm. Rhett and Daisy worked hard on their ranch, building their dream together, one day at a time. They faced the usual challenges of frontier life, the harsh weather, the unpredictable nature of raising cattle, the occasional threat from wild animals or disgruntled neighbors. But they faced them together, their love and partnership a source of strength and resilience. Rhett's work as a special investigator often took him away from home, sometimes for weeks at a time. But Daisy understood and supported his commitment to justice. She knew he was doing good, making a difference, using his skills to protect the innocent and uphold the law. And she was never truly alone. She had made friends in Red Rock, found a community that welcomed her, accepted her, despite her past. She had also reconnected with her father, who had finally come to terms with her choices and had even offered his blessing. The scars of the past still lingered, of course. Rhett still had nightmares sometimes, haunted by the violence he'd witnessed and participated in. And Daisy still felt a pang of sadness whenever she thought about the life she'd left behind in Harmony Creek, the friends and family she'd lost. But they had learned to live with their scars, to accept the past, to focus on the present, and to look forward to the future. They had found a love that was stronger than any adversity, a bond that had been tested and proven true. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, Daisy turned to Rhett, her eyes filled with a quiet contentment. "Do you ever regret it, Rhett?" she asked softly. "Leaving your old life behind? Becoming a lawman?" He smiled, his gaze meeting hers. "Never," he said. "Not for a moment. I was lost back then, Daisy. You found me. You showed me a different way to live. You gave me something to fight for." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "You're my heart's true compass, Daisy," he said. "You guide me, you keep me grounded, you make me a better man." His words touched her deeply, bringing tears to her eyes. She leaned into his touch, her heart overflowing with love for this man, this outlaw who had stolen her heart and given her a life she'd never dreamed possible. "I love you, Rhett," she whispered. "More than words can say." He kissed her then, a tender, passionate kiss that spoke of their enduring love, their unbreakable bond, their shared future. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Daisy felt a sense of peace, of contentment, of belonging. She was home. She was with the man she loved, in the place where she belonged. She had found her heart's true compass, and it had led her to a life of love, of purpose, of happiness. They continued to build their life together, brick by brick, dream by dream. They faced challenges and triumphs, joys and sorrows, but they faced them together, their love a constant source of strength and support. Their ranch prospered, their family grew, and their love deepened with each passing year. The heart's true compass, the unwavering love that had guided them through darkness and danger, had led them to a place of peace, of contentment, of enduring happiness. The vast, starlit sky above them seemed to echo their love, a silent testament to the enduring power of the human heart. Chapter 19. Where the River Bends. Years passed, marked by the changing seasons, the growth of their children, and the steady expansion of their ranch. Rhett and Daisy had built a life that was both fulfilling and challenging, a testament to their enduring love and unwavering commitment to each other. Rhett continued his work as a special investigator, though he took on fewer dangerous assignments, prioritizing his time with Daisy and their family. He had earned the respect of the community, becoming a symbol of justice and integrity, a far cry from the outlaw he had once been. Daisy, meanwhile, had become the heart of their home, a loving wife and mother, a skilled rancher, and a respected member of the Red Rock community. She had found her purpose, her place in the world, and she embraced it with grace and determination. Their children, a son named Caleb and a daughter named Sarah named, with Rhett's blessing and Daisy's heartfelt agreement, after the woman he had once loved, a tribute to the past and a symbol of hope for the future, grew up strong and independent, inheriting their parents' love for the land and their commitment to justice. One warm summer evening, as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching their grandchildren play in the yard, Rhett turned to Daisy, his eyes filled with a deep and abiding love. "We've come a long way, haven't we, Daisy?" he said, his voice tinged with a mixture of nostalgia and contentment. She smiled, her hand reaching for his. "Yes, we have," she replied. "Further than I ever imagined." They reminisced about their past, about the tumultuous events that had brought them together, about the challenges they had overcome, about the love that had endured. "Do you ever think about Harmony Creek?" Daisy asked, her voice soft. Rhett nodded. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I don't regret leaving. I found everything I ever wanted right here, with you." They fell silent for a while, listening to the laughter of their grandchildren, the chirping of crickets, the gentle rustling of the leaves in the breeze. It was a scene of perfect peace, of domestic tranquility, of a love that had spanned decades and weathered countless storms. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the landscape, Rhett noticed a rider approaching in the distance. He squinted, trying to make out the figure. "Who is that?" Daisy asked, following his gaze. As the rider drew closer, Rhett recognized him. It was Jedediah, the old prospector who had helped him escape from Sheriff Thompson all those years ago. Jedediah rode up to the porch, his weathered face creased with a smile. "Rhett, Daisy," he greeted them, his voice raspy but warm. "It's good to see you both." "Jedediah," Rhett replied, rising to greet him. "What brings you here?" "I have news," Jedediah said. "About Harmony Creek." Rhett and Daisy exchanged a look. They hadn't heard anything about Harmony Creek in years. "What is it?" Daisy asked, her voice tinged with curiosity and a hint of apprehension. "It's changed," Jedediah said. "Grown. Prospered. They elected a new sheriff, a good man. They're trying to build a better community, a place of justice and opportunity." He paused, his gaze meeting Rhett's. "They want you to come back, Rhett," he said. "They want you to be their sheriff." Rhett was stunned. He had never expected this, never imagined returning to the place he had fled so many years ago. Daisy looked at him, her eyes searching his. She knew this was a momentous decision, a turning point in their lives. "What do you think, Rhett?" she asked softly. He looked at her, at their children and grandchildren, at the ranch they had built together, at the life they had created. He thought about Harmony Creek, about the past, about the opportunity to make a difference, to right the wrongs of his youth. The river of their lives had bent, unexpectedly, offering a new path, a new challenge. He looked into Daisy's eyes, seeking her guidance, her support, her unwavering love. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Rhett looked at Daisy, his eyes filled with a mixture of uncertainty and resolve. The offer to become the sheriff of Harmony Creek was a stunning turn of events, a chance to revisit his past and, perhaps, finally lay its ghosts to rest. But it also meant uprooting their lives, leaving the peace and security of Red Rock, facing old prejudices and resentments. "It's a big decision, Rhett," Daisy said, her voice calm and reassuring. "We don't have to decide right away." "I know," he replied, his gaze shifting from her to Jedediah, then back to the rolling hills of their ranch. "But I feel drawn to it, like it's something I need to do." He paused, his hand reaching for Daisy's. "But I won't do it without you," he said. "Without your blessing, without your support. We're in this together, Daisy. Always." Daisy smiled, her heart filled with love for this man, this former outlaw who had become a symbol of justice and integrity. She knew how much this meant to him, how deeply he felt the pull of his past, the desire to make amends, to build a better future for the place he had once called home. "Then we'll do it together," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "We'll go back to Harmony Creek. We'll face whatever challenges await us, just like we always have. Together." Their decision made, they began to prepare for the move, a bittersweet process of saying goodbye to Red Rock, to the life they had built there, and embracing the unknown future that awaited them in Harmony Creek. Their children and grandchildren, though saddened by their departure, supported their decision, understanding the importance of this new chapter in their lives. They packed their belongings, sold their ranch, and said their farewells to their friends and neighbors. It was a difficult transition, filled with both excitement and trepidation. The journey back to Harmony Creek was a journey through time, a revisiting of the landscape that had shaped their lives, the places where they had met, where they had fallen in love, where they had faced danger and adversity together. As they approached Harmony Creek, Rhett felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of nostalgia, regret, and anticipation. The town had changed, as Jedediah had said. It was larger, more prosperous, with new buildings and a sense of renewed hope. But some things remained the same. The old church, where Rhett had stolen Daisy from her wedding, still stood, a silent witness to their tumultuous past. The saloon, the Serpent's Tooth, though renovated, still bore the scars of the shootout that had nearly cost them their lives. They were greeted by the new mayor of Harmony Creek, a young, ambitious man named Thomas Miller, the son of the former deputy who had helped Rhett expose Sheriff Thompson's corruption. "Welcome back, Mr. Callahan," Mrs. Callahan, Miller said, his voice respectful and welcoming. "We're honored to have you here. We believe you can make a real difference in this town." Rhett accepted the position of sheriff, taking the oath of office in front of the entire community, a scene that was both ironic and deeply moving. He was no longer an outlaw, a fugitive, but a lawman, a leader, a symbol of hope for the future. Daisy, standing by his side, felt a surge of pride and love. She had come full circle, returning to the place where her life had been forever changed, not as a reluctant bride, but as a strong, independent woman, the wife of the sheriff, a partner in his mission to build a better community. Their final confrontation was not a shootout, a battle with outlaws, but a confrontation with their own past, with the prejudices and resentments that still lingered in Harmony Creek. They faced it with courage, with grace, with an unwavering commitment to justice and fairness. Rhett, as sheriff, worked tirelessly to restore law and order, to build trust between the community and law enforcement, to create a safe and prosperous environment for everyone. He was a fair and compassionate epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to Rhett and Daisy's unwavering commitment to Harmony Creek and to each other. Rhett, as sheriff, proved to be a just and compassionate leader, earning the respect and trust of the community. He rooted out the last vestiges of corruption, ensured fair treatment for all, and fostered a sense of unity and progress. Daisy, by his side, became a pillar of the community, known for her kindness, her wisdom, and her unwavering support of her husband. She helped establish a school, a library, and a small clinic, contributing to the well-being and growth of Harmony Creek. They revisited the old church, the site of their dramatic first encounter, not with bitterness or regret, but with a sense of gratitude and closure. It was a symbol of their past, of the choices they had made, of the love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. They often rode out to the old mill, the place where they had faced their greatest challenge, where they had exposed Sheriff Thompson's corruption and cleared Rhett's name. It was a reminder of their courage, their resilience, their unwavering commitment to justice. Their children and grandchildren would visit often, filling their lives with laughter and joy, a testament to the enduring legacy of their love. They had built a family, a community, a life that was both meaningful and fulfilling. As the years turned into decades, Rhett and Daisy became a symbol of hope and redemption for Harmony Creek. They were living proof that the past, no matter how dark or troubled, could be overcome, that love could conquer all, that even an outlaw could find redemption and build a better future. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple, Rhett turned to Daisy, his eyes filled with a deep and abiding love. He was old now, his hair silvered, his face lined with the wrinkles of time and experience, but his gaze still held the same spark of intensity, the same unwavering devotion to the woman who had stolen his heart so many years ago. "We did it, Daisy," he said, his voice raspy but firm. "We built a good life together." Daisy smiled, her hand reaching for his, their fingers intertwining, a familiar gesture of comfort and connection. Her own hair was white, her hands weathered from years of work, but her eyes still shone with the same love and determination that had captured Rhett's heart all those years ago. "Yes, we did, Rhett," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "We faced the darkness and found the light. Together." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, a vast and endless expanse that mirrored the depth and endurance of their love. They had come full circle, from a stolen bride and an outlaw's desperate flight to a life of purpose, of justice, of unwavering love. As the night deepened, they rose and went inside, their hands still clasped, their hearts forever bound by the ties of love, of loyalty, of a shared journey that had spanned a lifetime. The final confrontation had been with their past, and they had emerged victorious, their love a beacon of hope and redemption, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. The gentle night breeze whispered through the trees, a lullaby of peace and contentment, a final, sweet refrain to their long and winding story. The end.